Welcome to this webinar on vendor management in the context of various IT regulations. My name is Kishore Vaswani. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ControlCase, and I really appreciate the time you're taking today to spend the next 30 minutes with us on this important topic of vendor management. Our agenda today is to really briefly introduce ControlCase, really spend some time for those of you who are new to some of the IT compliance regulations on talk about the 405 regulations as an example of use cases for vendor management. Then I'll go through a vendor management basic approach, which all of you can use as a high-level roadmap to form your vendor management programs beyond. We'll talk about some of the challenges, and then we'll open up the webinar for any questions and answers after that. A little bit about ControlCase. We focus on IT certification and continuous compliance services. We focus and make sure that we are not a checklist IT auditor and follow a partnership approach and use automation wherever possible to streamline the process. And we work on various compliance and certification regimes. You can see some of them over here, but there are many others as well, where we either help companies get compliant. In some of these, we certify companies. In other cases, these are governmental regulations that we help evaluate companies against. Our marquee offering is to do a single audit, a single assessment, and certify against multiple regulations, including some of the vendor management aspects that we are talking about today. So let's talk a little bit about the different regulations in scope. First of all, PCI DSS. PCI DSS is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, and it has been established by the brands to ensure that there is protection of data in the ecosystem as cardholder data is stored, processed, and transmitted. FISMA is the federal act, Federal Information Security Management Act, and it really makes sure that there's accountability when it comes to information security and privacy in the federal sector. And it requires federal agencies to implement a set of policies, procedures, and a set of third-party audits to ensure governance. So as we said, PCI is for card data, FISMA is for federal information, HIPAA is for healthcare data. And again, it's a government regulation that ensures that healthcare data is protected and private in the ecosystem. ISO 27000 series is a more general purpose international standard that covers the breadth of an information security program and important components of information security at a very broad level and at an organizational level. And then finally, from an energy perspective, the FERC and NERC set a set of critical infrastructure protection standards, which helps protect and give guidance to the energy sector and the critical infrastructure sector to ensure security and privacy of various components in the electric grid and various types of renewable and non-renewable energy. So I wanted to make sure I talked a little bit about the regulations because we are today talking about vendor management in the context of various regulations. So when we talk about that, the question is, why do vendor and third-party management? Well, the first answer is, while companies can outsource business processes, they are still responsible for security and risk, and they cannot outsource risk and absolve themselves of responsibilities just because they have outsourced a process to a third-party vendor. For example, if you're using a cloud environment, guess what? You're still responsible to ensure you're doing your due diligence on that particular cloud environment. I talked about 5 standards as an example, and so all these 5 standards actually also require third-party management, vendor management. There are various, words and techniques for this, but vendor and third-party management is required by most IT standards. And as an example, all the five standards we talked about certainly do require vendor and third-party management. Let's talk about a very high-level process on vendor and third-party management. And I'm going to make sure that we send out these slides next week, so you also have this list in, so you can match your programs against it. But at a very high level, first of all, you need to know who your vendors are. So registering and inventorying vendors is important. Categorizing them, creating a master control checklist, making sure the right controls apply, creating a risk questionnaire, distributing, analyzing, and then evaluating and tracking exceptions. These are some high-level bullet points that can be used to evaluate your program against. Of course, we're going to get into much more detail on each of these categories. So, step number one, if you're running a vendor or third-party management program, it is important to ensure that you have a good understanding of the list of vendors. Not all vendors are created equal from a risk perspective, but it is important that at least you start off with a holistic list of your third parties and your vendors. And that's usually an area where you can, if you're in IT and information security or compliance, that's probably a good area to partner with your procurement groups, because they, a lot of the third parties really fall through and come through the procurement and the supply chain groups in your company. So once you know who the vendors are, then you had to categorize your vendors. Now, every industry has different criteria that can be applied, but here are some common criteria you can ask yourself on how to categorize vendors. Number one, what type of data do they have? Do they store, process, or transmit it? Is it in physical or electronic? What business are they in, right? Are they a call center or are they a hosting provider? And then, are there any geography-based considerations when it comes to this vendor? And so these are some of the questions you can ask and tabulate to ensure categorization of vendors. Next, once you have asked the first set of questions, then you can ask yourself, is there, what's the real risk that exists from this vendor? Is it a high risk? Is it a low risk? What exactly are the risks to me? And what are the vectors that can go wrong from a vendor management perspective for here? Once you have tabulated your vendor and categorized them, then you come up with, okay, here is my information security program. It includes many of the areas you guys probably are very familiar with: policy management, asset management, all the different components that form a part of what we call the master control checklist. So this is not what every vendor has to be evaluated in, but this is the superset of controls that you want to evaluate vendors against. Once you do that, now you have the categories and you have the controls. Now you map what controls apply to what categories of vendors. For example, if no data is being stored, if you're not providing anybody any sensitive data, then maybe encryption does not apply, as an example. Whereas if you are providing some sort of data or they have access to your data, then encryption may apply. If card data, if the transactions don't include card data at all, then maybe PCI doesn't apply. Otherwise, it may apply. There might be different, as an example, there might be different controls that apply to background checks in one country versus the other. So once you're done with that, then you need to make sure that you create what we call as questionnaires. These questionnaires really would be a single type of questionnaire per category of vendor that you have now identified through the earlier process, so you can send it out to them. Once that's done, you then distribute these questionnaires to the various vendors. So if you notice, we have gone through a very systematic process of coming to targeted questionnaires, which then are sent to vendors to respond. Some of these questionnaires could be just yes/no questionnaires. Some of these may require the customer to provide an evidence. Some of them may go annually, some of them may go quarterly. Remember, we talked about how it is important to classify these vendors into risk categories, and hence the question and the questionnaires that need to be distributed can be tailored for that. Well, you've sent the questionnaire, now you have got back responses. So there are, again, depending on the category of the vendor, you could do a very high-level review, or you could do a multi-day, multi-week review, depending on the criticality of the vendor. So analyzing the responses is an important component of obviously doing your vendor management program. If your vendor management program just asks yes/no questions for all vendors, even high risk, that's probably a risk, because yes/no does not work in today's world, right? You want to make sure you collect some evidence and have folks on your team or folks on some teams review that evidence for accuracy and for making sure it meets the criteria of that control. Once that happens, then you can use your internal method or any industry standard method for providing a rating, right? So now you've gone through the evaluation process, you've gone through the whole thing. All right, now let's provide a rating to a vendor. The rating could range from all green to all red. And what you do after that is important, because you want to be able to track these exceptions to closures. So I went through a whole bunch of things. I'll just go over it at a very high level once more, so that we can obviously make sure we reiterate what are the different steps. Number one, make sure you register an inventory vendors, categorize them, create a master control checklist, map the controls to categories. You actually had to create these questionnaires that you want to send out. Then you want to send out these questionnaires to the vendors. Once you get back the responses, you want to analyze them. Give all your vendors a rating, and it could be based on category. That's a good way to look at the relative strengths and weaknesses of a vendor. And then once you give them a rating or a score, make sure you have a program that you track important exceptions, which are risks for your business, through closure. And that could be through contracts, that could be through penalties, that could be through SLAs. So we went through, how some of the regulations require specific vendor management, have specific vendor management requirements. We then went through a list of 9 steps that you can use tactically to compare your vendor management program against, or you could use those 9 steps to create your own vendor management program. We wanted to make sure in this webinar we gave you a set of tactical things you can take away from here and compare your vendor management program against, so that it is useful to you in a more broader context. We are getting towards the end of the webinar here in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So again, please feel free to put questions in the questions window, and we'll make sure we answer them. All right, let's talk about some of the common challenges. Running a vendor management or a third-party program is really not, for most companies, a job that can be done through, a very informal function. It requires a very formal function, and there are lots of challenges associated with it. First and foremost, the regulations keep on increasing all the time, and budgets keep on decreasing. So you have to do more with less. The number of third parties keeps on increasing over time, because in today's world, it is very common to outsource business processes to specialists. And so regulations keep on increasing, budgets keep on decreasing, the reliance on third party keeps on increasing. And so automation is very necessary to ensure that you are keeping ahead of the curve and when it comes to your third party or vendor management program. Also, once you do identify issues, how do you fix the dispositions? Because these are third parties. And sometimes the tools available, that you can implement within your organization are not available when you're trying to have a third party or a vendor fix the issue. And, some of the common things that can be done are SLAs, penalties, contractual terms, to name a few, that can be done to help enforce and get home the fact that it is important to close the dispositions when it comes to third parties. Another area, environments keep on changing all the time. When environments keep on changing all the time, guess what? The type of data, things change, the type of transactions change, and so the risks change. And again, you got to do an assessment more frequently, maybe automate some components, and so forth. And at the end of the day, like most business processes, unless you have a dashboard where you can quickly look, hey, who are my vendors? Have they been assessed? What are the risks? Are we in high, medium, low risks? What's their rating? What's their score? It's difficult to manage a program unless you hire an army of people. So automation is very important. Just a little bit about ControlCase. So we certainly use automation and AI in our certification and vendor management offerings. And, we certainly use a partnership approach to make sure you're able to evaluate your vendors, or if you're a vendor, you're able to respond to your customers in an efficient manner using our technology and our continuous compliance services. So we are right at the 20-minute mark. Our idea today was to make sure we give you a tactical list which you can use against your vendor management program, no matter which regulations you had to comply with. As I said, we will be sending a copy of these slides and a recording of this webinar. And really the main, if you can take one thing out of it, look at the 9 bullets we have in here, look at where you are compared to those 9 bullets. And some of it might be easy. Some of it might be as easy as if you have less than half a dozen or a dozen vendors. Really, just listing them out in an Excel sheet would be enough for the very first step. But it is important that process be in place and you are able to look through when you get a chance. At this point, we will take any questions. So please type them in the questions window and I will answer them in the order we got them. The first question was, are we going to get a copy of the deck in the recording? And the answer is yes. The next question is, if your third parties include massive companies like AWS, Azure, GCP, Rackspace, and other big cloud providers, how can we evaluate them? They may not allow us to assess them. Well, that's a great point. So when you have a third-party management program, let's kind of use this example of how you would go about it. So if you're using a cloud environment, then obviously, that's in your list of vendors that you use. As you go down the risk, obviously, when you are trying to get the completion of questionnaires, an alternative method to them completing questionnaires is for them to provide you with their certification documents. So an important concept of, when you outsource and evaluate the categories and risk to a third party is to ensure you are identifying which of your compliance requirements actually depends on the third party vendor, right? Because not everything would depend on the third party vendor. For example, if you're not sharing any data with them, you don't care about their encryption. For any cloud environment, and especially the big cloud environments, they have done their own certifications and they provide their own certifications, their own reports, and their own matrices on which controls these certifications cover. And so for the big cloud providers, you can actually rely on their certification and their matrices to complete your vendor management program, even if they are not completing the questionnaire. And so that's a very widely used technique. The next question is, how do you confirm what data elements should be defined for each regulation. Again, another good question there. In terms of, there are certain regulations which specify which data is in question. So PCI DSS, well, it's card data. That's what you're looking at. HIPAA, it's healthcare data, and that's what you're looking at. So there are some regulations which are more specific to verticals of data. Then there are other regulations like ISO, which are much more broad and policy, procedure, and process-based rather than they're based on specific data. Over there, a good technique if the data is not really specified is to broadly classify data into sensitive, confidential, public, and so forth, and then use those tags to ensure you're protecting it appropriately. The next question is, how is it possible to keep solutions up to date when these regulations change all the time? And that's a good question. I think regulations change all the time, requirements change all the time. Just like probably any other field, you have a set of specialist companies, companies that focus on IT compliance. They have usually armies of people, and we are certainly one company that does that as well. We make sure we keep up with the various IT compliance regulations and really use our technology to impart that automation and or that knowledge to our customers. That was the last question I had. Well, thank you everybody for your time today. Hope you had and learned something new in this webinar. We will be sending a copy of these slides so you can use the 9-point step, the 9-step process against your vendor management process. And feel free to reach us at www.controlcase.com if you have any questions or we can be of any help. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.